While in Belarus, still hundreds of people are detained, charged with hooliganism and participation in non-authorized demonstration. That's the reactions for protests which had taken place last week in the capital of Belarus, Minsk, and all over the country. KGB opened a criminal case for preparation of the mass gathering. Well, with that, 28 people are detained, 22 in prison, and 10 are already accused and may face from 6 months to 3 years in prison. In general, starting since the beginning of the protests in Belarus in March of this year, there were almost 900 people who had been detained. We do have here, we report about that, but we have here Gulliver Cragg, who is France 24 correspondent and covered the protests there. So we would like also the follow-up, but also to understand, you know, how was it there? What we need to know about those particular protests, which started with some kind of a positive note. They were against this law on social parasites. So, Gulliver.
Well, the protest started earlier this year against this proposal to tax what Alexander Lukashenko, the Belarusian president, calls social parasites. It kind of seems like a tax on unemployment. Anyone who doesn't work who only works half the year should pay this tax. Of course, it's actually designed to penalize people who are working in the grey economy and not declaring their income, or who are working for foreign companies and declaring their income and paying their taxes outside Belarus. It's not actually so cruel as it seems, but in a context where Belarusian people have seen their incomes fall really drastically in the last 2 years. There's been a 2-year recession in the country, and living standards are falling very, very sharply, and unemployment is really starting to be a major issue in Belarus, which it hasn't been up until the last couple of years. So people were really angry about that, and that's what made these demonstrations very, very different from previous demonstrations that there have been in Belarus. It wasn't really people protesting for human rights or for democracy or for those kinds of issues. It was people protesting because they're sick of getting poorer.
So, can you really describe, you talked to the people, what kind of people were there? Because really, that was very interesting, because the previous protests, when we recall on them, they were usually after elections, which were rigged, or some other things. So were the different kind of people coming to the streets, not political?
Well, around Belarus, in the protests that there have been this year, there have been protests in towns that had never seen any protests before. Since Alexander Lukashenko came to power. So it's absolutely people who never before were involved in any kind of political activism. So this is something very, very new. In Minsk, though, it's a bit different, because having seen these grassroots protests springing up around the country, the political opposition, the traditional political opposition, if you like, saw the opportunity to try to, capitalize on this and have a big demonstration in the capital, Minsk. And so the people coming to that demonstration were a lot more the usual suspects, if you like, the middle class, the people who are campaigning for democracy and for greater openness in Belarus. But I did meet people who'd come in from small towns to this protest in Minsk, and perhaps naively, because the protests so far this year had been more or less tolerated with some arrests, they were expecting to be able to go to a big demonstration. And then they got to the place where the demonstration was supposed to be taking place outside the Academy of Sciences, and they saw that the police were just arresting everybody. The police presence was so huge. They had the police vans queued up around the block, and anybody who tried to go to the protest site was just arrested. I mean, the police would say, "Don't come here or we'll arrest you." And then if somebody tried to go, they would immediately be put in the van. So there wasn't even really a point where a crowd was able to accumulate, a crowd of any size. And they'd been blocking people from coming into the city center of Minsk since the morning. In the previous days, they'd been arresting people who might be planning to participate in this demonstration. So they really shut it down, so that the protest didn't really even happen.
I mean, you've covered numbers of protests in this area in Eastern Europe, so really we expected, not this year, but before, there were the Belarusian police is pretty brutal. It can be very, very tough. Was it as usual?
No. They were much more systematic in that they were arresting everybody who tried to come to protest. But they were less brutal in that there were some cases where they were beating people. I think there's some video that you can see people being beaten. But mostly they weren't it wasn't even necessary for them to be brutal in the sense of being violent, because there were so many of them. They so completely outnumbered the protesters that mostly they just would, be 4 policemen per protester, would carry them into the van.
And besides the usual, this kind of the Belarusian opposition, we are following on them there. A lot of people are in exile. Some of them are inside the country. So were some other new groups of people, organizing or being more active? Have you seen some new grassroots, movement or some grassroots organization which were more active?
I don't know if there are any new organizations that have sprung up, but it's just like I said, not so much in Minsk, but in all these other towns around Belarus where there have been protests, that it seems very much a grassroots thing that isn't being led by any of the traditional opposition parties.
And of course we are looking what's happening with what will happen next, especially when President Lukashenko, Belarusian President Lukashenko, is a bit in a different position. Previously, we knew he has a really strong argument with the West. He had been called, the last European dictator of Europe.
Now we have a new. That. He likes being called that.
Yeah, now we have a new and a bigger and more important dictator as Vladimir Putin. But really, we didn't hear really a strong condemnation from the West. There is very interesting time when Belarus is balancing between Russia and the West. It's definitely not the we can't tell that there are really bad relations between Russia and Belarus, but still it's much worse. Why it's really the relations between the European Union and Belarus had to get better.
And Lukashenko, yes, had been trying to improve relations with the West. Sanctions had been lifted in the beginning of 2016. And the protests earlier this year, I think that's why there was no clampdown on the protests earlier this year in other towns around Belarus, because they didn't want to draw the anger of the West. But for some reason, he took fright. Around March 21st, that was when he announced that there was a plot for a violent uprising or a provocation of some kind for the 25th of March, and that's when he started arresting people. And it took, I think, a lot of people in the diplomatic community by surprise. According to one senior diplomat I spoke to in Minsk, the Belarusian Foreign Ministry were very, very disappointed that they were being forced to suddenly have this change of tack, because they felt they'd been making a lot of progress with improving relations with the West, and then the president suddenly, decided to go for a clampdown instead of tolerating the protest. But I think that there are a lot of people in Europe, although there are differences of opinion, but I think that there are a lot of people in the European diplomatic community who think that the answer to this is not to reimpose sanctions or to, end this process of dialogue with Lukashenko. They think that they need to just try and improve the dialogue and work particularly with the Belarusian Foreign Ministry, with whom they seem to have better relations than with the president itself.
And Gulliver, with you as a journalist who covered the protest, what would be the story to follow?
Well, everyone I spoke to in Minsk is very, very pessimistic about the economic situation. They can't imagine any solution while Lukashenko is in power. You can't expect him to impose the kinds of reforms that are needed, and which would be very, very tough reforms, and which would probably make him even more unpopular.
Also, without cheap Russian gas, for instance.
Yes, and they've got this ongoing dispute with Russia. It's not only because of the dispute with Russia, but also because the Russian economy is doing badly. That's the thing, actually. A lot of people thought that Lukashenko was the winner of the crisis in Ukraine because his image improved, he brokered the peace talks in Minsk, and so on. But actually that's not the case, because the crisis in Ukraine has led to sanctions being imposed on Russia. The Russian economy is doing very badly, and Lukashenko refused to recognize the annexation of Crimea, which made Putin angry with him and wants to put pressure on him. So Lukashenko's in a difficult position, and the economy is likely to get worse. And if the economy gets worse, people are going to be more and more unsatisfied. The big question now is, how much have they been scared by this very, very big show of police force that they put out last weekend? Probably for a while there won't be any more protests, or not attempts to have a big protest like that. But as people's living conditions deteriorate, especially, I think, in smaller towns around Belarus. Possibly, somebody told me, one analyst, that it's not necessarily clear how much you can count on the loyalty of the police in these very small towns where the police know they're the neighbors of people who might be coming out to protest and they've known them for years. Are they going to be prepared to go through with a big clampdown? Of course, in Minsk, yes, but in smaller towns, it's not so clear. And what a lot of people are predicting is that November will be the next big moment to watch, because much as in Ukraine, the Belarusian authorities are putting up tariffs on gas and electricity, and people are really going to be faced with huge bills that they won't be able to afford to pay, and they're going to be angry.